Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I will show you 3 ways that you can use opaque watercolors. From what I understand, this is not gouache nor watercolor. It is a new type of paint that Paul Rubens just released called opaque watercolor. They are more opaque than watercolor and they are slightly more transparent than gouache. So the 3 ways that I will be talking about today are multiple layers, reduce the number of layers in painting, and using it as transparent watercolor. I know the naming doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but that's the best I could come up with, so please bear with me. I'll explain them more as we go into each of the painting. So for the first method, most of my color mixture is going to be pretty creamy. So I didn't use a lot of water to mix them, and as you can see here, the consistency looks pretty thick. I'm starting out using this light green bluish color as my base, and I'm going to cover most of the background for the foliage with this color. I sometimes mix in a little bit more green and a little bit more blue just to vary the shade of green, make them look slightly more interesting with subtle changes in the green. I also got some comments recently saying that my video are a little bit too quick, so in this one I'm going to try to keep it real time in the first couple strokes so you can see how I'm doing it, and then I will speed up the rest of it where I just repeating the same thing over and over again, just so that the video doesn't last for 5 hours. I'm going to also put some timestamp down in the video description, so if you just want to see the main point and do not want to see the whole process of each of the painting, you can just click on the timestamp so we can skip to the next time where I going through the next step in the process. I do have real-time videos on my Patreon, so you can go check them out if you're interested. But for YouTube, I would like to keep it at a more reasonable amount of time so we can get through all the techniques in one video. Wherever you see a green that look a little bit more cool in temperature, that is because I mix more blue in the mixture. And if you see something that slightly more warm in temperature, this is because I mix more lemon yellow or maybe even a little bit of chrome yellow to make the green more warm. The paint is very smooth and it's had pretty good coverage, but again, because it's still slightly less opaque than an opaque artist grade gouache paint, I go over this mid-tone part a couple of times to make sure I cover the white of the paper. But on the other hand, it's also a very good opportunity for me to change the shade of green slightly within that mid-tone color. Different paint types has different properties, and we are going to try to adjust our technique so that we can use these properties to our advantage. For the top part above the foliage, I'm doing pretty much the same thing but with a slightly different color. So instead of green, I'm mixing a light purple bluish color. Now for the bottom part of the background, I'm mixing a very light skin tone-ish color with mostly burnt sienna and just slightly a little bit of yellow and a lot of white. And we are going to use this color to cover the rest of the paper. Now let's actually do some layering. So usually for gouache, I would start out with the first layer being pretty thin and watery, and then as I go more and more layer afterward, it will get thicker. But for these opaque watercolor paints, what I found worked best for me so far is that I would keep the kind of creamy consistency throughout all the layering process. If you have a more watery consistency, it would be more transparent and the underneath layer would show through. While if you make it too thick, then it will be really hard to put the next layer on top of it. Now, having transparency paint is not a bad thing. We are going to use that in our third method, but in this method in particular, I'm trying to create opaque layers on top of each other. And we are going to use the darker green that we just mixed to put down the shadow part for these foliage. And just like the midtone part, you will see me adding some more color to that mixture, making it sometimes slightly more blue and sometimes slightly more yellow to change the shade of green for the shadow. And again, try to keep a consistent water to paint ratio to make a creamy mixture throughout the whole process. I tried using a more watery mixture when I first started out on the background like I would usually do with gouache, but then what happened is that it was a little too transparent for that particular type of painting that I was going for. So I ended up having to cover that whole area again with a slightly thicker mixture. So it wouldn't hurt if you started out with a watery mixture, but it also wouldn't help if this is the style that you're going for. One of the property of these opaque watercolor paints that I really like when using with this specific method is that they dry super quickly. So I don't really have to wait any time at all for the previous layer to dry before I can put down the next layer, because they dry pretty much instantly. Now, because also of this property, some other method, for example wet on wet, may be a little bit more challenging. But again, we are trying to use these properties to our advantage, and in this case, layering is the way to go. So if you are someone who really like layering with gouache, and you also don't have the patience to wait for them to dry out usually, and you're having trouble layering because of that, then I would definitely recommend trying these paints out because they dry super quickly and yet their consistency is pretty smooth and I haven't seen any cracking so far. Do keep in mind that they are slightly more transparent than a artist grade gouache if that's what you're used to. So definitely swatch them out on some piece of paper, experiment with the consistency a little bit before you start going into for the full painting, just so you can get a hang of how the consistency works. I definitely would experiment more with wet on wet method after this, and I will come back with another video if I find an effective way of using these opaque watercolor paints for that method. Now after that look a little bit more crowded with different shade of green, I'm gonna going in with a very much lighter green than the rest of it to start adding more defined leaf shape for our foliage. Now as I start adding these leaves, you will notice that I struggle a little bit to make them opaque. Some of them doesn't come out as smooth and it looks like the layer underneath is still showing through. The reason for that is because the brush I was using is a little too stiff, so the paint doesn't come out as smooth as I would like them to be. After a bit, I would switch to a slightly smaller and a softer brush, and you will see that I can get those leaves opaque a lot easier. You can start mixing a thicker mixture than what we've been doing here, but you really don't need to. I try to err on not mixing a thick mixture unless I really have to, just in case I want to put even more layers on than I originally intended. It's not always easy to get an opaque layer of paint on top of a already very thick layer of paint. To make the leaves look more natural, I vary the size, the shape, and the orientation of each of them a little bit as I go, and also the color. Some of the green have again a little bit more blue to it, while the other has a little bit more yellow to it. Some of the leaves are bigger, some are smaller, and some pointing toward the left hand side, some point toward the right hand side, some point upward, some point downward. Just to varying shape and form, making the leaf look like they have variety, just like how we see them in nature. Here you can see me switch to the softer brush, and I was able to get some of those leaves to be opaque a lot easier than what I was doing before. So a little bit of recap for this method is that I start out with the midtone, and then I add in the shadow part, and then I'll add more defined leaf and more highlight in afterward, all by using the same consistency mixture of paint, putting one layer on top of another, waiting for the previous layer to dry, and also making sure that my brush is not too stiff. Another thing to keep in mind is that just like gouache, these paint when they dry a slightly different color than when you put them down. So the lighter color will dry slightly darker, and the dark colors will dry slightly lighter. If you put down a stroke and you see that this is not the value that you like, just wait a couple seconds, because this paint do dry pretty quickly, just so you can see the final value of the color after it had dried. Now I start adding the flowers on top of everything by mixing a very light blue and purplish color as the base color for the flowers. And just like our leaf foliage with the flower, I also going to vary the color of each of them slightly, making some of them more toward a reddish purple and some more toward a bluish purple. I also going to add some very light green flower, mixing in with these purplish flowers. Besides the color, just like the leaf, I also changed their size. Some of them is slightly bigger, especially the one toward the left hand side, and some of them are smaller because nothing in nature is exactly the same size, and by making them have different sizes, we make them look more natural. Here I'm going back in with a smaller brush to add some detail on each of the leaf, pretty much just adding kind of like a stem in the middle, and for some of the leaf, besides the main middle stem, I add some more little stems branching out from that main middle one. Now after I add more details to the leaf, I'm going to add a little bit of shadow on each of the flower by mixing their midtone and then just make them slightly darker. So for the more bluish flower, their darker tone would be more of a ultramarine blue, while for the purple one, I kind of mix ultramarine blue with a little bit of red to make it slightly more purple to the red side. And for the green, I'm actually just going to add more highlight on them instead of some shadow. So for the highlight, we're doing pretty much the same thing, but with a very light color. I use almost pure white and just mix a little bit of blue or purple or green in each of the flower case. And there we have our first painting. So for our second method, we are doing something very similar to the first one, but I'm trying to reduce the number of layers that we have to do on top of each other because opaque watercolor is slightly more transparent than gouache, and the more you layer, it's gonna get a little harder as you go. It is not impossible as we just did it in the first painting, but we're gonna try to make it easier for us by reducing the number of layers that we have to put down. And to do that, instead of filling the whole page with background color, I'm going to actually sketch out my foreground element first. So in this case, you can see there's only 4 daisies. So we would layer our background separate from our foreground. And when I put down the background, I'm going to avoid these foreground elements. So let's say both our foreground and background total have about 10 different layers. In the previous technique, we would just, keep layering them one on top of another, all 10 of them. But in this case, you would separate, let's say our background only have 5 and our foreground only have 5. So in each of the area, your maximum layer would only be 5 instead of 10 like in the previous method. In terms of consistency, I keep everything the same. So we're trying to mix a creamy consistency throughout the whole painting and throughout our layering process. Now I'm going to start filling in the color for these daisies in the foreground. And I'm going to start layering this middle part of the daisy with some warmer yellow. And just like how we did in our first method, you want to make sure that your previous layer has already dried before you start putting down your next layer. If not, then your new layer may just blend in with the previous one. Now I'm mixing a lot of white with lemon yellow and going in for the highlight on the middle part of the daisies. After that, we're mixing more of a warmer yellow using some burnt sienna and chrome yellow, and we're going to add some shadow around the outer edge of these centers. Now I'm using pure white to paint the flower's petals. Here I'm going back to the background and start putting in some shadow with the darker green. I just tried to put this shadow kind of randomly around the background, and most of them are just random brushstroke, but on some of them I tried to do a little bit of negative paintings, which you about to see right here. Instead of painting the leaf, I'm using that dark color to cover the area around the leaf, leaving only the silhouette of the leaf behind. now we're going back in again with a more blue and darker green to reinforce the shadow part and make our highlight leaves pop out more. And after we're done with the background, we're going back in and start layering the foreground. Since our flower petal is already pure white, we're not going to get anything lighter than that, so I'm mixing a little bit of blue into white And we're going to start adding a little bit more shadow, making the petal some more defined, especially in the area between each of the petals. And we are done with our second painting. For our last painting, I'm using these paints just as I would normally with watercolor, which means I'm adding a lot of water and making the paint very thin. Especially for the very first layer, these paints is already more opaque than normal watercolor, so you want to make sure you mix a lot of water with just a little bit of paint to get the transparency that we want. For the third painting, I already sketched out the hydrangea flower. For the sketching part of this flower, I'm going to refer you to Urban Kate in CA. She's an amazing botanical watercolor artist. She has a very detailed and very easy to follow tutorial on Instagram on how to sketch this particular flower. I will put the link to her profile in the video description. So I'm using the very watery paint that we just mixed, and I'm using that as the base color to cover this whole flowers. If you run out of paint and you need to mix more, just try to keep the consistency the same, which is very watery, so that we can get this nice transparent layer. Now going into our next layer, we want to add a little bit more paint and less water. However, unlike the previous two methods where we want a creamy consistency, for this one, even though you add a little bit more paint, you still want to make it very watery. Essentially, we want the color to be darker and a little bit more vibrant, but we still want the paint mixture to be relatively transparent. For some of the petals, like the one I'm painting right now, I started out putting down that mixture that we just have, but then I adding more water and tried to blend those out instead of keep adding the mixture in. With this, I can get the middle part of each of the petal to be slightly darker, and as it moves toward the edges, it will become slightly lighter. Now I'm gonna mix in more paint to make the color darker, but still keep the consistency watery. So if you start to see that your consistency become a little creamy, make sure to add a little bit more water. In this particular method, we want our previous layer to actually show through, and so we want our new layer to be transparent, unlike in the previous two methods where we want everything to be completely opaque. This is also one of the things I like about these pens, is that I can use them both as wash and as watercolor, whichever I like them to be. It could also be really useful if you like plein air or if you travel and you want to bring some paints with you. With these opaque watercolor paints, you can create both a watercolor transparency look and also an opaque, more gouache look. So far, I really like them. I will keep you posted if I find any problem with these paints after I use them for a while. Though, like any other products, there's pros and there's also cons. I do have some minor complaints that I find actually pretty common with brand that sells, gouache or watercolor paint in set in general, is that you cannot get them as individual tubes. And for me personally, I know for sure that my primary colors, so like all the reds, all the yellows, and all the blues, will run out before any other colors. And also the white, if I'm going to use them as gouache more often. And when they run out, I have to face an option of whether I have to buy a whole new set, which kind of seems ridiculous, or I would have to replace them with some other brand that actually sell individual tube. Another nitpicking thing is that usually with gouache, when I buy the paint, there's always the indication of opacity and light fatness on the paint tube. Paul Rubens doesn't have that in this set, so it's really up to you to actually swatching out the color, trying them out so that you can get a feel of each of the color opacity because they are different from each other. Although I would highly recommend you do that for any new paint set that you buy anyways, because sometimes the indication on the tube may not be correct. So for the rest of the painting, it's pretty much just the same thing, adding more layer on top of each other, while still making sure that their consistency is watery so that they're slightly transparent and the previous layer can still show through from the top layer. And in this painting especially, we are not using any white at all. If we want to make a color lighter, we just add more water to it. So we would have to work from light to dark. Once you make a color darker, there's no going back. You cannot make them lighter. Unlike the previous method, if you were to add white to this color and then try to use that to make some of the area lighter, it's going to look a little bit weird because everything is transparent while that particular area has an opaque look to it. Of course, if that is what you're trying to achieve, then totally go for it. But traditionally with watercolor, you don't even see the white color when you buy a set of them, because for watercolor artists, the white of the paper is going to be your lightest white that you will get, and we just add darker and darker layer on top of them. I think knowing how to use transparent paint and work from light to dark is really important because it kind of teaches you how to see the negative space. And after you do this for a while, when you come back to gouache, you may actually see things differently, and it may make it faster or easier for you to paint in gouache. At least that's what I find from my experience. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. The rest of this video would just be me finishing this painting with some chill music. If you have any question about any of the technique that I talk about, feel free to leave a question in the comment and I'll try my best to answer them. Other than that, thank thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.